Mr. Schiff.
Thank you. My name is Peter Schiff, and I guess you can say I am in the economic and financial gloom and doom business. And thanks to this body, President Obama, the Federal Reserve, business is booming. And, you know, I would rather profit from America's success rather than her failure, which is the reason that I'm here today. We have some serious structural problems underlying the U.S. economy, and we cannot solve them until we understand them. As a nation, we have borrowed and spent our way into a gigantic ditch. We are not going to get out of the ditch by digging it deeper. We have to reverse the mistakes of the past, not repeat them. Government stimulus will never grow this economy. It will never create jobs. It is the equivalent of trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. We have to understand that the housing bubble, the financial crisis of 2008, two events that I predicted and warned about, were the consequences of government stimulus. We stimulated our way into this problem. We're not going to stimulate our way out. In fact, the stimulus is actually a sedative. The stimulus is preventing the free market from unraveling the problems that years of bad monetary and fiscal policy have created. We don't need more spending. We need the opposite of spending. We need underconsumption. What the economy lacks is savings, investment, production. And if we try to preserve the jobs of the bubble economy with more reckless money printing and borrowing and government spending, all we are going to succeed in doing is preventing the restructuring that we need and preventing more productive jobs from ever coming into existence. And I want to talk, specifically about jobs. I'm an employer. I employ about 150 people. I would probably employ 1,000 more if it weren't for government regulations that have inhibited my ability to hire and grow my business and have forced me to move portions of my business overseas in order to escape the regulatory burden here. But the question is, why do I hire people? Where are these jobs coming from? Jobs in a free market, they come from two things. They come from profits or the profit motive, and they come from capital. You need both to create jobs. And in a free market, there's going to be jobs. And if there aren't enough jobs, Congress has to ask, what are we doing to inhibit this process? How are we preventing jobs that would normally be here from coming into existence? Now, in order for me to hire somebody, I have to be able to make a profit. That means that the person I hire has to deliver to me more value than the cost of employing them. And the cost of employing them is not just the wages I pay them, but it's all the mandatory benefits, the taxes, and more importantly, the legal liability that I incur when I hire somebody. In fact, one of the riskiest things you can do in America is to hire somebody. And because of that reason, because of all the liability from government, from lawsuits that you have put on employers, most small businesses, their main concern is how not to hire people. How can I grow my business and hire as few people as possible? That is not something that happens in the market. That is something that happens as a consequence of government. The other thing that you need to create jobs, in addition to profit, is capital. People work for me because I have capital. I have tools that my employees lack. They come to work, I give them an office, I give them secretarial support, I give them computers, I give them leads, I give them a brand, I give them all sorts of things. But where does capital come from? It comes from savings. It comes from underconsumption. Either I have to save it myself or I have to borrow it from somebody else. But there is no money to borrow because it's all going to government or something that government guarantees, like education or home mortgages. There is no credit available for small businesses. It's actually a paradox, but what we need is higher interest rates. Higher interest rates encourage savings. These low interest rates are of no benefit to typical businesses. Yeah, it benefits government. Government can borrow all this money through the bond market. Some of the major corporations have access to cheap money. Wall Street can gamble with it. But small businesses, they can't sell bonds. They need to borrow money, and there's no savings available. There is nothing there. So businesses can't get capital, and there is no incentive now to hire because the costs are too high. You're looking at somebody who's sitting here who was actually fined, and I'd be happy to talk my experience. I was fined $15,000 by security regulators because I hired too many people. Because I hired too many people, I incurred over $500,000 in legal bills defending myself because I hired too many people. Because I hired too many people, I've been on a hiring freeze ordered by regulators for 3 years. They have not let me hire people. They have not let me open new offices, despite the fact that I was dying to do it. I had plenty of demand. My business was growing, unfortunately, thanks to what you guys were doing. But regulators prohibited me from doing this. And there's all sorts of ways that rules and regulations have inhibited my business. In fact, it's now so expensive. I started my securities firm in 1996. There is no way that I could have started that firm today.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. We appreciate that.
The problem.
Sure. First of all, demand doesn't come from government spending. Inflation comes from government spending. Demand comes from supply. You can't consume something that isn't produced. So we have to make things first. But as far as regulations are concerned, certainly we need to stop piling new regulations on top of the existing regulations. But more importantly, we got to start repealing a lot of the rules and regulations that are already in place. Look, there are millions of Americans that are unemployed. How do we increase the demand for labor? It's simple. You bring down the cost of labor. Regulations substantially increase the cost of employing people, and as a result, fewer people are employed. I mean, there are simple things you can do, from getting rid of the minimum wage law, which you can do this afternoon, which would create millions of jobs, and more importantly, help people get trained for much higher paying jobs in the future. Right now, they're never going to get jobs. But the regulations that increase labor costs and that subject employers to all sorts of lawsuits if they don't create jobs in precisely the manner that some bureaucrat thinks they should be created. You have to level the playing field between employers and employees. You can't lose your rights because you hire somebody. You can't give workers some kind of special privilege and then call it a worker's rights. Workers don't have special rights because they get a job. Everybody has individual rights, and you shouldn't lose them because you hire somebody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of downgraded this because the lack of the deal, the agreement addressing how serious this situation is. And to insinuate that, oh, it was because Congress had a vigorous debate, I thought that's what we're supposed to do in Congress, right?
Congress is certainly supposed to have a vigorous debate.
Exactly.
Part of the puzzle, though, was that this Congress refused to put raising taxes, especially on the wealthy, as a part of that package. And that would have been an important way to get to the goal that S&P wanted. I mean, you sort of...
an important way to tax the people who create jobs, too.
And they caused the crisis.
Yeah. Mr. Schiff.
It was
definitely. We're going to get to the good doctor from Tennessee next, and then
it was definitely the deal, not the discussion. And with due respect, I did call the financial bubble, and I criticized S&P and Moody's and Fitch at the time for putting AAA ratings on bonds that I knew were going to go to zero. And in my opinion, S&P didn't downgrade the United States far enough. That's the problem. But I would love to address some of the points that Mr. Cummings
made. Make it real quick if you could, Mr. Schiff, because I want to get to...
Well, he made so many points, but you're right about one thing, that the bad regulation didn't start under Obama. We have a lot of regulations that need to be undone, but it's not just the intent. I don't argue with you that in some cases the intent of the regulation is good. The problem is the consequences are the exact opposite of the intent. And infrastructure, infrastructure spending doesn't stimulate the economy. It drains the economy of resources. Infrastructure only helps in the long run when you finish the project if it raises the productivity of the nation. But in the meantime, we are too broke. China can put in these airports because they're rich. We're broke. Before we can afford to improve the infrastructure, we need to have more serious restructuring of our economy. We have to start making stuff. We need more factories before we can start figuring out how to make our roads prettier. What percentage of my income should the government take? What do you think would be fair?
I'm not going to give you a number.
Well, just give me a guess.
Here. Yeah.
Well, what do you think would be fair? You say I'm not paying enough taxes. How high should my taxes be? What percentage of my income should be taken away from me by the government?
We have a progressive income tax
structure. But just what do you think would
half?
60%, 70%? How much should they take?
Wow, well, that is so far beyond.
Well,
we're going to wait.
But I'm just,
hang on.
Let me say that taxing the rich.
The gentleman from Tennessee has the time.
Yeah, I'll just interrupt. Taxing the rich is a great idea till the rich run out of money, and that seems.
Well,
to be
no, my problem is I'm already almost paying half my income in taxes right now.
Hang on a second.
That is impossible.
No, it's not impossible.
Correct.
No, it's not.
Okay, let me, Mr. Chairman. Let's shift gears for 1 second because this is going to go on forever. Dr. Boucher, do you feel that government, Dr. Boucher, do you feel that government jobs create revenue? And I think you said that the stimulus one had the majority of jobs created were private sector jobs. Do public jobs create revenue, or do they just cost the taxpayers money?
Recovery dollars that have gone, dollars that go on to communities to say build a bridge, You hire engineers, typically in the private sector, some in the public, some in the private. You hire contractors, you hire people that do concrete. You hire a lot of folks in the private sector, and then that has spillover effects. So that if you hire that person who has the concrete, and then they go and they have more money, and so they spend it in their community, that's how those private sector jobs are created, both directly and indirectly.
Mr. Schiff, do you feel that's a good return on your investment to spend those tax dollars that way? I mean, what's your chance of making a profit?
Well, first I want to point out that 99% of my income is taxed at the marginal rate, so the marginal rate is my rate. And if the Federal Government has taken 35% of my income, and then another 3% for Medicare, that's 38, and then when I have the State of Connecticut now almost 7%, over 45% of my income in tax, and that's before I pay any property taxes or sales taxes or anything else like that. And if you raise my taxes much more, that's it. I'm done. I'm already moving businesses to Singapore, moving businesses to the Caribbean to try to go to lower tax jurisdictions. We are not a low tax country. We are a high tax country, and we're a much higher tax country than we used to be in the past by far. And I don't remember what your other question was.
Well, I'm out of time, but I'm just going to close.
The economy is going to be stabilized. So, in your opinion, and I know you do the same thing, I have to borrow a lot of money for my business to work, but when you can't borrow it, and when the regulations become so overburdened that it makes it difficult for lenders to give it to you, it's bothersome to me. So I think it's very important that people understand this isn't easy, what we're doing. It's very difficult, and government's made it harder for us.
It takes two to tango. I mean, you can only borrow if somebody is saving. There has to be a lender on the other side of that transaction. There has to be something in it for the lender. You have to have higher interest rates. The problem is the banks are just getting money from the Federal Reserve and turning around and buying treasuries with it. That's not going to grow the economy. That's going to grow the government. But meanwhile, these monetary policies are stifling the savings that we need to grow the economy. And Mr. Cummings pointed about he can, when people get a stimulus job, he can see those jobs. Yeah, you can always see the jobs that government creates. What you don't see are the jobs that they destroyed to create those jobs. All the government can do is rearrange the resources. It doesn't create any wealth. But the problem is the jobs or the wealth that gets destroyed is more productive than whatever the government replaces it with. And so on balance, the country is poorer as a result of that. And it doesn't, the fact that if we send out a stimulus check, it's not going to stimulate the economy. If an American goes and buys some more products that were made in China, how does that help our economy? It runs up the trade deficit, and now we had to go deeper into debt to spend that stimulus check. All of that is counterproductive. And we're going to continue to repeat these mistakes. We're going to keep on throwing gasoline on this fire until we incinerate the entire country.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Now yield to the gentlelady.
Well, ideally, you would abolish the corporate tax completely. I mean, corporations don't pay the taxes. Their shareholders pay the taxes. So tax them at the shareholder level. The employees pay the taxes when they get paid. But again, ideally, we'd have no income tax. We'd have no payroll tax. If the Federal Government needs revenue, let it raise it through a national sales tax. It would be much more conducive to tax people when they spend their wealth, not when they accumulate it.
I agree with all that.
The argument is always that, well, if we only tax spending, the rich don't spend all their money. Precisely. The money they don't spend is what grows the economy. That's what produces the jobs. If they're not spending the money, it's benefiting everybody but the rich. The rich enjoy their wealth when they spend it, and so that's a much better time to tax it. But as far as your budget plan, I think Congress is much underestimating how much time we have to deal with this crisis. I think there is a sovereign debt crisis and a currency crisis coming to this country soon, maybe even before the next election, and that will be far more catastrophic to our economy than what happened in 2008.
Well said. I mean, I couldn't. The window of time to fix this is closing very rapidly, and it just underscores how serious
tax cuts are very powerful. They provide a boost to direct income and, in turn, spending, which is important to growth. This 2% tax cut, Mr. Schiff, you're in agreement with that payroll? No. You're in disagreement with that?
I think the deficits that will be created to finance that tax cut will do more damage to undermine this economy and destroy jobs than any benefit we will get from the extra income being spent.
And so when the President says that, basically borrowing the words of my Republican friends, that we should not be increasing taxes during a recession, but when it comes to these taxes, you have a, I mean, do you agree with that, first of all?
Well,
in other words, when it came to the millionaires and billionaires, my Republican friend says, you know, friends, and I heard them clear. No, let me finish. They were singing from the same handbook. They were singing loud and clear. In a recession, you do not raise taxes. And the president said it the other night, said, you know, we want to make sure these folks continue to get this extra $1,500 or whatever it is in that $1,500 on their paychecks.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
The problem is the damage that the government does to the economy is not limited to taxation. It's spending. It's what the government is spending that is damaging the economy. And so if we run deficits instead of taxes, we actually do more damage. Deficit spending is more detrimental to the economy than taxation.
I got you.
But what we need to do is dramatically reduce government spending. That is the only stimulus that will work.
We'll disagree on that. I think we need to do both. I don't think that there's any member of Congress that does not believe that we need to do both. Mr. Boucher, what's your opinion on that?
Well, it's hard to understand how government spending
I'm sorry, Dr. Boucher. I like to give people their titles, like President Obama.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Congressman Cummings. Schoolrooms in places across the country with 40 children is not good for America's future. It's not good for America's workforce. We can do something to fix that. We can borrow at historic low rates, and we can pay it back as the economy gets back on track. And I'd like to take issue with one thing that Mr. Schiff said earlier, which is that America can't afford it. America remains one of the richest countries on the planet. To say that we cannot afford to make these investments right now when our economy needs it most and get 14 million people back to work is quite frankly absurd. We can afford it. It's just how we're using our resources.
We can afford it. And the problem is interest rates are low now. They're not going to stay low. We've got a $15 trillion national debt financed with Treasury bills. It's the same mistake that people made who were taking out subprime mortgages. What's going to happen when rates are at 5% or 10%? What's going to happen when interest on the national debt consumes 100% of federal tax receipts? That can happen in just a few years. Interest rates got to 20% in 1980. What happens if they go there again?
Madam Chair, I see my time is up, but I just want to need 15 seconds to say this. You know, one of the things that we've got to do, we have got to invest in our people. If you got kids, one of the greatest threats to our national security is our failure to properly educate every single one of our children. That's the greatest threat. And if we have to spend now to educate our children so that they can take over this world, innovate, create jobs, and do the right thing, fine. At the rate we're going, though, if we're not careful, we will implode from the inside. Because we're not doing all the things we need to do now.
We're spending and not educating. We don't need more spending on education. We're spending too much, and kids are not getting educated. We need more on-the-job training. Unfortunately, we have too many kids going to college on government grants. It's bid up the price into the stratosphere, and we have all these kids graduating with huge mortgages and no houses and no marketable skills.
I'm saddened by those comments.
Thank you, Mr.
Saddened by what those programs have done to our young people.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings. I yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Schiff, because I believe you're onto something, and I would tell for those that did not experience this, I remember it very vividly because I paid 1% over prime for my floor plan costs. So in the early 80s, when prime was around 21%, which people say that's not possible, it is, and in the artificially low rates that we're working with today, any type of an idea or a scenario, what could happen when these rates that are being kept artificially low, and we know for the next, at least until the election, there's going to be a low prime rate. But when it rises to what it should be, market value, the effect that it's going to have on businesses.
Well, I mean, the problem, the artificially low interest rates right now are one of the main problems that the economy has, and I think we're pursuing those rates to prop up insolvent banks, to necessitate the government bubble, the borrowing from the federal government. And when interest rates ultimately rise, all the banks that you guys bailed out, they're all going to fail again because they're insolvent. They're only kept afloat by the cheap money from the Fed. Their portfolios are loaded up with low-yielding, long-term mortgages and government bonds. And when interest rates go up, the value of those assets will collapse. But they have to go up because eventually the dollar will sink so much, prices will rise so much, nobody will lend us money. The dollar won't be the reserve currency. Right now it's kind of benefiting from the fact that there are problems in other parts of the world. But look at the price of gold. It's at $1,900 an ounce for a reason. Right? It's going up because of all the inflation that we're creating now and all the inflation that we're going to have to create in order to keep interest rates at these low levels. And the only way to solve our problems is to let interest rates go up. And they're going to go way up. And then what are we going to do? I mean, if we keep inflating this bubble, if we let the national debt get to $20 trillion and then rates go to 10 or 20%, what people are saying now is exactly what they said during the real estate bubble. People used to tell me, Peter, you're crazy. Real estate prices will never fall. Well, now we know what happened. People are now saying the same thing with interest rates. We don't have to worry because interest rates will never rise. They will stay low forever. They won't.
No, and you're right. The only thing we know for sure is they're not going to rise before the next election.
Well, we don't know that for sure. They're going to try everything they can to prevent it.
And the other thing that's going to happen is we print money that isn't backed by anything. Our lenders are going to say at some point, you're paying me back with money that isn't worth what I lent you.
We're destroying the value of our money, and that's why prices are rising. Oil prices aren't going up. In fact, Ron Paul pointed out in his last debate, you can buy a gallon of gasoline for a dime, as long as you have a dime that was minted before 1965. It's because our money is being debased by the Federal Reserve, and that's what's happening. Prices aren't going anywhere. The value of our money is declining, and it's going to lose a lot more.
Part of the challenge we face today is if you can produce a better product for less, which also includes less labor, that's how you end up being a world-class creator of jobs. Isn't that the principle that for some reason stimulus, simply adding jobs by paying for them, does the exact opposite of less labor perhaps, but world-class labor that produces a better product for less? Mr. Schiff.
Absolutely. In fact, to point out, Henry Ford was famous for paying his workers $5 a day.
Highest in the world at the time.
Yeah, but that was 1.25 ounces of gold, which at today's exchange rate is $2,500 a week. So Ford's workers were making $2,500 a week, the equivalent. They were paying no federal income taxes and no payroll taxes. There was no minimum wage and there were no unions. We paid the highest wages in the world, yet we produced the best quality, least expensive products. How was that possible? That was because we had the smallest government. We had minimal regulations, low taxes. And if we want to recreate American industry, we have to recreate that environment. We have to allow businesses to grow and prosper, and we have to remove all the roadblocks and the impediments that Congress has placed in their path over the years.